Welcome back to Rand on Real Estate. This is Greg Rand on 77 WABC. The website is gregrand.com. We've got a blog on there. We've got highlights from previous shows and some clips of me on Fox News and Fox Business Network talking about things just like this. And we're going to be focusing right now on the Great Depression. But I want you to stick around for the last segment because we've got somebody coming on the air who lived through it and did what it took to survive and even thrive through it. And that should be, it's the first time I've ever heard anybody talk about the Great Depression and not talk about the soup line. So let's look forward to that. But the Great Depression, what really happened? Let me just give you kind of a historical timeline from an everyday guy's perspective after reading everything I can on the subject. What I basically understand to happen here was in 1918, World War I ended. And that was the worst at that time war that America had been involved in. Well, I shouldn't say that because I guess the Civil War was even worse, but you know what I'm talking about. Once in a generation. And during the war, the agricultural industry in America was the biggest industry. And after the war, it was the biggest industry, meaning it generated more GDP and it employed more Americans than any other industry. And it was supplying wheat and grain and all kinds of other products to the war effort. And on as the war effort went on, the output, the exports of the agricultural industry kept growing and growing and growing. Well, when the war ended, because the federal government knew that all those jobs, they couldn't afford to have all those jobs be lost, a period kicked in where on the one hand you had government policy where they were continuing to compensate the farms to keep producing these agricultural materials, wheat, grain, products, things like that. They kept doing it because they wanted to keep people in jobs, but they didn't actually have a market to buy those things. And two things happened. One, spent a lot of money, and two, they destabilized the prices of those products across the globe, and it had an impact in the macroeconomic world of destabilizing the economy. But you've heard of the Roaring Twenties, okay? So a couple of years after World War I ended, we had the Roaring Twenties, and the Roaring Twenties sound a heck of a lot like the Roaring 2000s. People were making money, businesses were flourishing, everyday people were investing in everything. Okay, the stock market had an unprecedented number of investors in it and dollars in it. There were companies whose stock prices were way out of whack with how much profit they actually generated. This sounds kind of familiar, right? How about this? You had banks that started inventing new ways for everyday people, real estate investors, to control property. I read a letter that was written by a lawyer to a friend of his back then who said, this is a rough quote, he said, all my friends are real estate investors now, real estate speculators. Or actually, I think he actually said, everyone I know in town, from the butcher to the baker to the barber, they're all land barons now. They're out there in the outskirts of town putting options on every property they could find. But that's interesting because options means no money down, or just a little bit of money down, I should say, and you control a property because you're speculating for the rise of values later on. And something else I found is that banks invented something called an interest-only loan for these investors. So the first time, I thought this thing came about in the last 10 years, but I guess history repeats itself. So all in all, by the end of the 1920s, things were rocking and rolling. Everything was going great, except for the fact that it was a house of cards. And in 1929, the stock market crashed in a very big way. And a lot of people talk about the stock market crash as the cause of the Great Depression. But if you read on it and you speak to people who lived through it, they'll tell you that was the first outward sign of the Great Depression. But what really caused it was this destabilization of economic forces, a massive trade war that happened between the nations that were at war after World War I, where tariffs and licensing costs and just, imports and exports went through the floor, and there was massive unemployment in the agricultural business once the government stopped continuing to prop it up. So, bubble, massive optimism. They use the term irrational optimism in what I've seen out there about this. And what happened after the crash is that there was a pessimism that set in. And that pessimism was well-founded because a lot of businesses went bad. The stock market went bad. People were frightened that the money would not be safe in a bank. And there was an attitude, a way of life that kicked in with people who lived back then, everyday consumers, that let's get the money out of the bank. Let's get it in the mattress. Let's dig a hole in the basement and bury it. And let's not spend anything, okay? And a period of pessimism kicked in. And I'd like to play a clip here because Dr. Schiller talks about this. Dr. Robert Shiller talks about this in a lecture that he did recently, and I find it really interesting. Let's play it and talk about it.
Middle of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And the problem at that time was very clear. Why were we in a depression? It was because people perceive that we're in a depression. It's as simple as that. To quote Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who also opined on this, the only thing to fear is fear itself. If everybody thinks that the whole economy is in a bad condition, then it will be in a bad condition, because everyone will pull back on all of their expenditure plans. And all of the otherwise entrepreneurs, or many of them, will decide, well, I'd like to be an entrepreneur, but not now. I can't raise any money. Nothing can work now. And so it all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay. I have to take a deep breath here. So it all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, we've played a lot of clips of Dr. Schiller on this show. I call him the father of the housing meltdown because he's the guy that predicted that what was a very predictable correction in the housing market, that after a decade of steep appreciation driven by some crazy lending standards in the banks and really a froth of optimism about the real estate market, that there would be a correction in price. But you're not going to get on TV if you talk about a real estate price correction. You're only going to get on TV, and you're only going to sell a lot of books if you go out and start talking about a housing meltdown. So here, Dr. Schiller makes it very clear. Now, I know, by the way, that if I said this, if I said, quote, the reason why we're in a depression was because people perceived we were in a depression, I would get hate mail and hate blog like there's no tomorrow, which happens frequently when I dare to be optimistic during the Great Recession. But here it was the esteemed economist, Dr. Schiller, who basically laid out the following. Number one, the reason why the Great Depression lasted as long as it did was because people were afraid to spend their money. They were afraid to live. They were afraid to invest. They were afraid to do anything because they were totally convinced that another shoe was about to drop. And that it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, those words will live in infamy. A self-fulfilling prophecy coming out of the mouth of a guy who was the father of the housing meltdown. And arguably, people's total lack of faith in the housing market, people's fear of the housing meltdown, drove us into a deeper recession than we otherwise would have been. People are walking away from mortgages who are just barely underwater because they think their values will never come back. Because they think the vocabulary of doom, when you say housing meltdown, you don't mean its prices will come down about 30% and they'll level off. When you say housing meltdown, people think you mean meltdown. It's over. Done. Collapse. Over. Finished. So this guy, I got to say, he makes me sick because he is getting rich selling his books. And his new book, Animal Spirits, which is a good book, basically goes into great depth on this phenomenon of consumer confidence. And he basically writes about it as if he's got no involvement in this whatsoever. He writes about the fact that those things that influence people's confidence to the negative will prolong the pain of any kind of an economic down cycle. So congratulations to Dr. Schiller. He gets the Weenie of the Week award again because there's just something really sinister about knowing about self-fulfilling prophecies, explaining the Great Depression as being exactly that, and then being probably the most influential guy to give us a repeat of that again in modern-day times. Whew. This is Rand on Real Estate. You're listening to Greg Rand on 77 WABC. Stay tuned because we have somebody who lived through the Great Depression who can tell us firsthand what it was like. Back in a moment.